Okay, so we're starting chapter 8, looking at China and its interactions with the world. It's not just China, though, it's East Asia in general. So we'll also look at how China's cultural interactions spill over into Japan, Korea, and Vietnam as well. So let's get right to it. So the first idea, the first Roman numeral we look at is the idea of China reemerging as a unified group under the sway. So when we talk about Chinese history, we look at it through dynasties, through dynastic cycles. So consider this kind of like what happens with European kings and how like a king has a son, a prince, and when the king dies, the prince becomes the king, and it keeps going down. It's a family bloodline. Same thing happens in China. They just, instead of kings, they're called emperors, and it's a ruling family, just like what happened in Europe, but it's a dynasty. So we have the Sui, the Tang, and the Song dynasties. The Sui is a very short-lived one, but it helps to reunify China. The Tang and the Song are really what you want to be more familiar with, especially the Song. The Song are instrumental in this time frame. So to understand China in this era, you need to be well versed in Confucianism. So remembering and recalling some of the things about Confucianism, it's all about interactions with others. It's about respect for your elders. It's about an emphasis on education and learning. It's very patriarchal. And so it's all about interactions, whether it be like a ruler subject, husband, wife, father, son, those kinds of things, right? So in earlier Chinese dynasties, they utilized an exam system to choose their government leaders, their bureaucracy, basically. And so this ruling class is made up of anyone who does well on these exams. So as I've kind of told you before, the Chinese exams at this time, it's kind of like the SAT for us today, where how well you scored on that exam dictates your future in some ways. And for China here, it was what kind of government position you've got. And so during the Sui, the Tang, and especially the Song, they're going to really, really ramp up that Confucian-based exam system. And unfortunately, just like modern day exam systems, typically the wealthier you were, your family was able to provide you more support to prepare for this exam. You might have a private tutor, or you have less physical work you have to do. Thereby, you have more time to study and prepare, learning Confucian sayings to be ready for these exams. So while we say that, there was the opportunity for anyone with their own intelligence and ability. So if you're a poor class, you could still study, do well in the exam, and get a good government job. So it was still merit-based. It was just more likely for the wealthier families to be able to have their children probably do a little better on it. So, but it did become so contentious, and it became so desirable to score well in these exams. There's so much pressure on people that they had to start instituting a lot of anti-cheating policies, where they had to prove who you were, so people weren't taking tests for each other. They started doing like pat downs going into the exam system because it became so there's so much pressure to do well, be successful on those. Sound familiar? The China in this area is growing, both at a population and economic standpoint. And one of the most essential features that does that is this Grand Canal that's built that stretches across northern China. It's 25,000 miles spanning across northern China today. I'm going to zoom in on this map here for you to kind of see what we're talking about. The Great Wall here stretching across the northern border. Now, the Great Wall was built much earlier than this time frame, more in the Han Dynasty and earlier. So the Great Wall is to keep out nomadic groups that would come in and like pillage and plunder these cities. And so as a result, China wants to have more of a defense. That's what that Great Wall means. Those nomads are going to come into play a lot later on in this chapter. The Grand Canal itself, as you see, connects two of the major rivers, the Yellow and Yangtze. And particularly what's going to be important is the city of Hangzhou, because Hangzhou, as you see, has access to East China Sea, thereby Pacific Ocean, and then eventually they can work their way, as we talked about in our Southernization article, into Southeast Asia and into the Indian Ocean trading networks. So this canal is super important because canals allow you to transport goods easier. It's much easier to transport large amount of goods via water than via land because it takes less work, less labor. So it's important. Hangzhou, that city that I just pointed out to you, becomes the largest city in the world at the time with a population of over 1 million people. So to put that in perspective, China at this time had about 120 million people total, which the United States were just under, probably around somewhere around 400 million. So China had about a third to a fourth of the United States population in 1000 CE than we do today. Just some kind of comparison for you. So part B of this first Roman numeral, let's look at how women are, or what women's roles are in China at this time frame. So first off, women tend to have more freedom in the Tang dynasty, and that's probably because the Tang dynasty and that family had more of a nomadic culture / historical influence. Nomadic groups tend to be more equal in terms of respect towards genders, because the work that they contribute, and it's tends to just make their society value it more, especially because they're usually so mobile and less sedentary like other groups that farm do. And so that's why we believe that. And the patriarchy comes back full swing during the Song era, and that's because they're going to really heavily utilize Confucian thought and process. In the Song, they oftentimes consider women weak or distracting to men as they're focused on their educations and then thereby their government jobs and big picture things. So women are supposed to be, subservient to their husbands. So especially in Song era, there did tend to be less opportunities for women, though there are some variances here, which I'll get into in just a moment. Probably one of the most memorable pieces from China at this time frame that tends to kind of be an eye catcher, so to speak, for people is the foot binding process. So I'm going to zoom in on this photo here. This photo is of an elderly Chinese lady that had experienced the foot binding process. And essentially, they considered small feet to be beautiful in China. And so what they do from an early age, they would wrap a child's foot, a female child's foot. I mean, sometimes young's 4 or 5 years old, and consistently wrap that tight every day. So the feet, the bones of the feet wouldn't grow. So their feet would stay relatively small. So small feet were considered beautiful, and they would put the smaller wrapped bound feet in these very delicate and ornate shoes that were very beautiful. It had a lot of designs on it. And so in the long run, it kind of became a symbol of status and wealth, because wealthier families could afford to have their children in some ways like maimed or crippled, like as you can see here in this photo. And also you have, servants available to do the work for those wealthy women who may not be able to really walk or carry things that well on their feet that are bound as such. So this isn't really a common practice in China today, but it is something that is kind of iconic from this time frame, and a pretty tough practice for a lot of women in this era. Not only that, in terms of how women were physically restricted, there's also some restrictions in terms of job opportunities. So in China, they were going to start to commercialize the weaving process. Weaving was traditionally done like in the household, like the mother might make garments and clothes for the whole family. They're going to start, as China urbanizes more, they're going to start adding more shops, and they might have a collection of workers weaving in the back of the shop, and then they'll sell that cloth or clothes out front. And so they kind of take women making some extra income by selling in markets from what they made at home, by men being the weavers in these more large-scale outfits in this commercialization process. So basically means women are losing job opportunities. However, because China is urbanizing more, and there's larger urban centers, there's also newer jobs available to work in maybe some of those shops or in those urban centers. There's a more of a wealthy class that can pay for more maids or domestic service or tutors, or particularly you also start to see like the concubine, prostitution side of things as well, because it was another way for women to make money. So there are more jobs available because there is more money and more of a growing economy as a result. However, it is kind of an interesting playoff, because while there are a lack of respect for some women, they do have more access to property rights in the Song era, especially like inheritance rights if a husband or father dies and the wife is the only one left to inherit everything. So that was a much more improvement for them, or even a choice more of what the dowry would be for a marriage, and also more access to education. So while there were some more restrictions in the Song, there also, you can't say it was all bad or negative, so to speak. All right, so that's Roman numeral number one, Tang, and the reemergence of unified China. We'll pick up next with China and the nomadic groups, how China deals with outside areas. Thanks for watching. Okay, so Roman numeral 2, we're looking at how China interacts with the rest of the world, whether they be nomadic groups or other kingdoms like Korea, Vietnam, or Japan. So first, let's talk about the tribute system. So you're probably familiar with the tribute system, or you've probably heard of tribute, maybe by like the old Hunger Games kind of thing. So tributes are basically, a tribute is a payment or a gift in exchange for something else. Maybe it might be other gifts or protection, something like that. So in theory, China considered itself the center of the world. They are the middle kingdom. They're the middle of everything, right? And that outside groups, barbarians to them, should recognize their superiority, whether they're nomadic groups or from Japan, whatever. Keep in mind the term barbarian is relative to who you are. Everyone likes to think that the other group, the group that isn't them, is barbaric. Romans considered non-Romans barbaric, right? So China then thinks that those foreign groups, whether they be nomadic or from elsewhere, should pay them tribute. And that's what's called, and they would do that via this kowtow. So they would pay the tribute, they give them gifts, pay the Chinese off essentially, and then they would get gifts or protection in return. China wouldn't invade them. And they would do this, signifying Chinese superiority by performing the kowtow ritual when they met the emperor, which basically, as shown here at the bottom, they would physically put their forehead like all the way flat on the floor in front of the emperor, bowing, showing respect, presenting the gifts. The emperor would offer gifts as well, and everything would go hunky-dory, so to speak. And this is a way for China to manage groups outside of their traditional border, to like have those interactions, to not always be so violent. So that's how it goes in theory. In practice, though, it's going to be much different. So really, China considered itself as, this middle kingdom and, all powerful, but realistically, they're really vulnerable to nomadic raids and groups. So as I mentioned in talking about the Great Wall here, we'll get a little bit more there into this map in just a moment. So China is very vulnerable to nomadic groups coming in from north and western Asia and raid, pillaging, and plundering towns for goods. Particularly, there's two groups. One's called the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu are in the Han era, so it's a little bit outside of our range of dynasties that we're talking about, but that's one group. And then also Turkish nomads that moved across Asia, particularly from like that Mongolia era. So what they would do is they would pay off those nomadic groups with silk and grain. Chinese silk was very desirable as they harnessed the silkworm early on. So they pay them off so that they wouldn't keep attacking their the rim of their territory, so to speak. Particularly one group to note is what's called the Jin. The Jin sees a part of northern China. So on this map here, when the Tang dynasty is starting to weaken, the Jin will actually take over a huge swath of traditional Chinese territory. In fact, even where part of that Grand Canal was and Great Wall is. And the Jin are more of a nomadic group, and the Song dynasty, as a result, then has to pay them off in order for protection. So they have to pay them silver, silk, tea. Otherwise, they may have physical conflicts with the Jin. So you see then the trade-off here of where, yes, they thought that they should be getting gifts and recognized as Chinese superiority, but in essence, actually, there was a lot of nomadic groups that put their pressure on the Chinese governments and dynasties throughout their history. So that's a little bit more of how the tribute system worked. We'll continue on looking at how China interacted with Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. Thanks for watching. Okay, so let's continue looking at China and East Asia, starting with how China interacts with Korea, Vietnam, and Japan, aka Roman numeral 3. Starting with Korea. So first off, the Korean Peninsula was typically set up similar to Chinese dynasties in that there were smaller kingdoms in charge of areas, and then eventually there's one particular family, the Silla, that will use Tang aid to basically put the entire peninsula under their control. And as a result, then Korea will become a tribute state to China. They're not directly ruled by them, but they, of course, recognize the superiority of China, provide the gifts under the tribute system, get protection in return, and they work closely then with the Tang dynasty in that sense. Some of the things that will happen as a result of this, Koreans will head to China to learn Confucian thought and process. They'll apply that to their government structure, which will be very similar to what you'll see in China at this time. They'll also adopt a lot of the traditional patriarchal Confucian tendencies. Traditionally in Korea, women would like raise their children in their parents' household. Like the husband would join his wife and new family. Women even had like a say in who they were marrying instead of like arranged marriages. They had to almost like choice and marry for love. That's kind of crazy, right? And so as a result of the reinforcement of Confucian thought and patriarchy, women are going to lose a lot of freedoms under their traditional Korean way of life because of this influence of China. So that's definitely one of the negative aspects that we've seen from the mimicking of Chinese way of life for women there. And this especially happens with the elite. Korea does maintain some of its own unique culture. One thing, for example, they still maintain their and develop their own alphabet. It's called Hangul instead of using a traditional Chinese languages. So that's their way that they maintain some of their own uniqueness, as opposed to just solely copying and becoming just a clone, so to speak, of China. All right, moving on to Roman numeral 3, part B. Let's talk about Vietnam. So Vietnam was actually directly ruled by China for over 1,000 years. And as the Tang dynasty starts to weaken, there's a rebellion that comes about. And it's that point that then Vietnam is able to gain its independence, technically. And it's through that time frame, over that 1,000 years of rule, that the elites, the wealthier classes, the bureaucracy basically that's ruling Vietnam is absorbing a lot of Chinese culture, but it's not really trickling down to the average everyday person as much. When Korea gets its independence, it becomes a tribute state still. So they still had a lot of Chinese influence. They recognized Chinese superiority, and China had influenced them already for like 1,000 years. However, for the everyday person in Vietnam in this time frame, they still practice a lot of some of their traditional Southeast Asian cultural pieces. Women tended to have more freedom, especially in like choice of who their husband might be instead of like an arranged marriage. They had more like female gods and deities, like even like a female Buddha. They still practiced cockfighting. So pictured there in the top right, where you've got basically two roosters fighting to the death. Typically, and a lot of like gambling and stuff would come about from that as a form of competition. And a lot of commoners still choose to chew on what's called Batel nuts. Batel nuts, it's kind of like caffeine a little bit. How if we're relying upon caffeine, or somebody might be relying upon tobacco products. If you think of almost like dip, it might work well for you, because Batel nuts, a lot of people would chew on them and have them like in their mouth, and they get a little bit of like a boost, an energy boost, kind of like a caffeine or what tobacco might do for people. But it also is very damaging to their mouth, kind of like what dip tobacco would be today. A lot of people would have like terrible teeth and oral hygiene as a result of that. So that was something that was kind of looked down upon by the Vietnamese elite as the everyday person did that. So that's Vietnam and China. And then finally, let's look at Japan and China. So Japan, of course, is physically separated. These other areas are all attached to Asia, the mainland area of Asia. Japan, of course, is a series of islands. It's not far off the coast of China/Korea, but as a result of that, they're able to maintain their, political independence, and they're going to voluntarily and selectively borrow Chinese influence. We call this the Heian period of Japan. And so that means like in Korea and Vietnam, it was more forced. Vietnam, they were literally ruled. Korea is a tribute state. Whereas Japan, it was like they chose to go learn about China. That was led by one Japanese noble, Shotoku Taishi, who will help organize a bunch of scholars, monks, artists, all to visit China to learn about Confucianism and their way of life and art, and about Buddhism. And they'll all bring that back to Japan, and that's going to influence Japanese way of life for the next millennia and a half, essentially. Definitely the next couple hundred years for sure. Japan in this time frame is a decentralized state. So basically, there's a bunch of little kings, lords, they're called daimyos, around that are in charge of smaller regions of Japan. And then there's like one larger emperor, like king, kind of like a larger king in European feudalism. When we get to Europe in chapter 10, I'll make this comparison again. Historians love to compare how Japan and Europe, halfway around the world from each other, had very similar state systems. Like with ancient Europe, you've got like kings and lords, and then knights and peasants. It's basically the same structure in Japan as well. It's just some different names than what you're maybe traditionally used to. For example, the samurai were the knights, and they had a code similar to what the knights of Europe had of chivalry. Theirs was called Bushido, a way of life. So a lot of similarities there. We'll talk about that more in chapter 10. One of the most interesting things that you'll see is that the traditional Japanese religion of Shinto is very spirit kind of based religion. They're called kami, and these spirits might be represented by ancestors. They might be more nature based, and they can influence life. And so that didn't really clash too much with Buddhist thought. And so you actually see a little bit of a blend of the Buddhist thought coming from China with traditional Japanese Shinto, and it forms a syncretic blend for their religion. And so we use that word syncretic or syncretism. You need to really understand this word. It's a big, important keyword for world history. Historians love to use that. If you can tell me that this was a syncretic blending of a religion, it makes you sound so much more astute, smart, and that you really know what you're talking about. So understand that when something blends, it's syncretism. Okay? In this instance, it was Shinto and Buddhist religious thought. All right, finally, in Japan, the women were relatively more free, especially elite women, and that's opposite of what happened in Korea. Korea started off being more progressive in terms of gender, but then once the Confucian patriarchy came into play, women lost a lot of opportunity. In Japan, women maintained, especially elite women, a lot of their freedom. One of the reasons they think that is because when Japan went to study China, they did this during the Tang Dynasty. And if you remember, the Tang Dynasty had a lot more nomadic influence because of the Tang family, and nomadic groups are typically a little bit more equal in their positions towards gender. So one good example I can give you of that is what's called the Tale of Genji, which is pictured here. This is a very famous and classic Japanese text written in this time frame, and it's actually written by a Japanese woman. And it explains a little bit about court intrigue and things like that. So if you're ever interested, you can check that out. But that's a really good example of a female author having a classic work in Japanese literature at this time frame, and showcases some of that freedom that they have. All right, next we'll pick up looking at some of the advancements technology-wise that's happening in China and how they impact the world as a result. Thanks. Okay, continuing on in Chapter 8 notes. So we've looked so far at how China has impacted areas around them. That's where we last left off, looking at their influence on Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Now let's talk about some tech, how China impacts all of Eurasia and what China receives in return. The first part is that in terms of what China gives. So really key technologies and components here. One, China revolutionizes salt production and basically starts to ramp that up. Salt production is really important because food tasted really bad back then, and even something simple as like a table salt was amazing. That's why Columbus tried to go up to Asia to get spices because like food was so bland back then. It's really amazing to think about, but. So salt production becomes a hot commodity or a highly desirable commodity from China, along with like tea, silk, like we've talked about before, things like that. Really revolutionary, though, and something that China does not get enough credit for is paper. All right, they're going to make paper, and then what's so important about that is on that paper they will use a printing press. Okay. Everybody wants to get all big on Johannes Gutenberg and go Eurocentric and say the Europeans had the printing press first. Lies. China, a good 500 years before Gutenberg, had a printing press. Now, of course, the Chinese language is a lot different from the Romance languages that we're used to and how our letters are organized, so to speak. But in general, it's the same process of where you have movable blocks. That's what's pictured here. And you would arrange it to say however you want, and then they would copy that onto paper. So they were able to spread ideas and information as a result of this. It's very immensely helpful, and especially for spreading Buddhist texts. Okay, so super important there. Moving on in terms of other things, the invention of gunpowder. Gunpowder is another game changer. It's supposedly Buddhist monks actually figure out how to use gunpowder, and it's initially kind of used for like fireworks and shows and stuff. But then we start to learn that this thing goes boom and can really cause some destruction. And so over time, gunpowder will be utilized in warfare. Game changer. Used to be you could hang and hide behind your big walls and you'd be fine. Like, I don't know, build a great wall. No, and it was really hard to destroy the whole wall until things start to explode with gunpowder. And so that's going to change the game once they start to adopt that in China and other areas of the world. One of the reasons that European feudalism with all their castles and stuff back in the day in the Middle Ages ends is because of gunpowder. Those castles got blowed up. So revolutionizes things. The compass. So some of this might be coming back from your Southernization article, but the compass refers to navigation technology and how important that becomes as it spreads into the rest of Eurasia. So in general, Chinese goods improve the quality of life for others. They become highly desirable. There is a trading network that runs across Asia itself called the Silk Road. It's not one specific road, but the Silk Road is basically a connection, a series of trading posts along the way that people, would get something in China and then they'd trade it, halfway across Asia. And then eventually, though, goods would make their way even all the way to the Middle East. The Silk Road is one trading network. The Indian Ocean, like I previously showed you, is another example of a trading network. We'll look at trading networks a lot more in your next unit. So also, when I use the term Eurasia or Afro-Eurasia, you need to be familiar with this. Afro-Eurasia refers to the entire continental mass of Africa, Europe, and Asia, the Eastern Hemisphere, so to speak. It does not include the Americas. If we say Eurasia, that's focused on Europe and Asia together, not really talking as much about Africa. All right, just some understanding what these terms mean. Okay, so what does China get in return? So what do they receive? This is part B here. So on the receiving end, you've got cotton and sugarcane are going to spread from China to India. We know, based on the Southernization article, that India clothed the world, quote unquote, because of their revolutionary cotton production. India is also the first to crystallize sugar, and as a result, their sugar production will be instrumental in terms of trade with China, because sugar, man, tastes delicious. Now, what you've really got to understand of why China's population booms in this period is a fast-growing strain of rice that they get from Vietnam. Yet again, this is referenced in Southernization. We call this champa rice, and I love that word, champa. But in general, why champa rice was so important is that it's a fast-growing strain of rice. You can actually get double the yield in a traditional harvest season. You can basically harvest twice in one season. Older strains of rice that they use in China, you can only harvest once per season. So by harvesting twice with champa rice per season, you are doubling output of food. When you have more food, you can feed more people. So you're more likely to have more babies because people were more secure in their food sources. It's important. Not only that, they get windmills, so powering technology from Persia, harnessing the power of wind and also eventually water as well. Now, Buddhism will spread into China. Buddhism originates in India, as we said before, and will spread into China. And one of the ways it spread so easily is because of the printing, the block printing that we talked about. And you're able to have those paper texts more easily available. All right. China also is starting to have a lot more term cosmopolitan cities due to the Indian Ocean trade in southern China. And so I'm going to zoom in on this map. You saw this a little bit on Southernization, but what we're talking about here is that these cities here in southern China have a lot more diversity. You've got traders from India possibly heading there. You may have Muslim merchants from Southeast Asia. So these centers tend to have a lot more just different groups of people from, various places across this Indian Ocean trade network. So as a result, it's a little bit more open in terms of new ideas and things of that nature. And in fact, this is kind of an interesting point. Under traditional Confucianism, back in like the Han and older dynasties in China, merchants were considered like greedy or had a negative connotation with them. Now, merchants are going to be a lot more socially acceptable because of what they're bringing to the table. All these new goods and the wealth associated with that becomes important. Merchants probably do more to change world history than all these kings put together. It's kind of interesting to think about. Okay, let's move on and let's talk about China and Buddhism. So China and Buddhism is a very interesting love-hate relationship. And we're going to look at how that traditional Buddhist thought might conflict with some of the Chinese philosophies of, like, say, Confucianism, or also might blend kind of easily with, say, Taoism. So first off, Buddhism will conflict with Confucianism in a couple of different ways. So one, in Buddhism, you got the idea of like infinite time, reincarnations until you get out of this cycle of suffering of birth and death and rebirth. And when you achieve that nirvana, then you're out of that cycle and you're just, you're with the one, the world, so to speak, the great spirit. On the flip side, in Confucian lifestyle, they're not necessarily focused on a religious answer to things. Confucianism is oftentimes more focused on day-to-day interactions with people. And Confucianism thinks about honoring your ancestors, generations, right? Great-grandfather, grandfather, so on and so forth. Or a dynasty, a family in charge of China, noting the Tang dynasty ruling for so many, 100 years, those kinds of things. So the way they view time is slightly different in terms of Buddhism and Confucianism. You've also got the way that Buddhists achieve their nirvana by individual salvation. A lot of Buddhists would be monks. They would go live in those monasteries. And by this individual notion is really going to contradict traditional Chinese Confucian lifestyle of family-based, of filial piety. Remember, filial piety is the idea of respecting your elders and honoring them and working for them and helping them. A lot of like Chinese parents are going to be angry if their son or daughter goes off to be a monk and isn't available to take care of them. It's usually the son, right? The daughter goes into her husband's family in patriarchal China, but you know what I mean. So if their son goes off to be a monk, who's going to carry on the family name? They've given up the earthly possessions and things like that. So that's going to conflict with traditional Confucian Chinese society. Now, you are going to see Buddhism start to shift into China and be incorporated in some aspects into Chinese culture. Buddhism will stick in China. It leaves India. It's pretty much never going to have a long-standing foothold in India, but it originates in India. It's going to have more long-standing impacts and implications in East Asia, Japan, Korea, China, Southeast Asia, that. So one example here is what's called Zen or Shan Buddhism, or Chan, whatever. My pronunciations are terrible. I'm sorry. And this is a blend of both Taoist and Buddhist principles. So this is one of the earliest blends that you see here. When you see that word blending and it's referring to philosophy/religions, you go, syncretism. Yes, this is a syncretic blend. So when you're thinking about this, understand that Taoism, in terms of how Taoists approach things, a very nature-based, more kind of spiritual idea, respecting life, those kinds of things, well, it actually kind of goes hand in hand with some of the ways that Buddhists look at things, how, they are in harmony with nature, how they respect life. So a lot of those things are very easily able to blend, and it's not very conflicting. So early on, the easiest way for Buddhism to gain hold in China is for the association with Taoism, kind of molding it into this Zen Buddhism. So this is one of the branches of Buddhism that really start to take hold in China and in East Asia. Now, you've also got, by the Song dynasty, the Song are going to utilize that Confucian principle to really kind of maintain control of China. So you're going to see a blend into what we call Neo-Confucianism. And Neo-Confucianism is going to take hold in not only in China, but also utilized in other parts of Asia, especially like Japan. And Neo-Confucianism blends all three, Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, taking some aspects of how Confucianism applies to daily life, but also answering those spiritual questions with Taoism/Buddhism. And so Neo-Confucianism starts to be a way to incorporate aspects of Buddhism, but that's not till later in the Song dynasty. Okay, when we look at China and Buddhism, we need to talk about how it becomes incorporated here. And essentially, what you're looking at is a specific branch, not only just Zen Buddhism, but even like a smaller piece of that. So the way I'll compare this to you in terms of how religions are organized are different branches or denominations in Christianity. Here in the South, you probably are most familiar with Christianity as it's one of the more prevalent religions in this area. And if you're a Christian, you might be a Baptist, and your friend might be a Methodist, and your other friend might be a Presbyterian, and your other friend might be a Catholic. But you all are Christian in the fact that you follow the teachings of Jesus, essentially, right? So it's the same thing under Buddhism. You can't just say Buddhism and that's everything. Buddhism applies to so many different little nuances to it. So it evolves over time. So one kind of sect, one particular branch that evolves in China as well, is a specific place called the Pure Land School. It's not a place, excuse me. It's not a school. It's a philosophy. It's a school of thought. The Pure Land School takes the idea, because original Buddhism was not very clear in terms of how you achieve that nirvana. It's like, go meditate and, figure it out. This is going to give you a little bit more thought and process. And one of the things they do is they give Buddha a little bit more of a godlike status by believing in Buddha, by repeating, by doing chants. That would give you the path to achieve nirvana. It becomes very popular in China during this time frame. And especially, it's during the Sui emperor, as the Sui are kind of putting China back together, because before the Sui, China was very, didn't have any unity. The Han Dynasty had been broken apart for a couple hundred years, so China was kind of all over the place in terms of one political unit. And so when the Sui started to put China back together, Buddhism had kind of made its way into China during that break of dynasties. And there's actually a Sui emperor, Wendi, who really supports Buddhism. They'll build a lot of monasteries. They'll even use an exam qualification to enter monkhood. Wait a minute, that sounds a little Confucian, doesn't it? So you see how sometimes these ideas overlap and interact with each other over time. So you actually have state support during the Sui with Buddhism. Very interesting. This map here will show you that basically by the time frame of about the 700-800s, you've got Buddhism that originated in India. It's really spreading all across East Asia, into Southeast Asia, into Korea, into Japan. And part of that is when Korea and Japan were learning from China, as we talked previously. Okay, so China did initially have state support under the Sui, but over time, they're going to lose that state support. And that's what B looks at. So eventually, people start to resent Buddhists. The monasteries get very wealthy. One of the reasons is this: Buddhism and trade go hand in hand. You cannot discount the two, because there were a lot of Buddhist monasteries set up all over Asia. These merchants, as they're traveling all over the place, oftentimes they'd stay at a Buddhist monastery, have a place to stay there. All right. So the Buddhist monks look after these merchants trading, and the merchants get to stay there. And then oftentimes they were like, thanks, Buddhist monks, for letting us stay. Here's a gift. And so those monasteries grew a little wealthy as a result of that. And then also the merchants would be like, those Buddhists are pretty good people. Maybe might convert to that. So those merchants might also then spread the teachings of Buddha as well as a result. So these monasteries get wealthy. Oftentimes they didn't have to pay taxes. We'll talk about that soon. And it also causes a lot of resentment because monks leave society, like I talked about in an earlier slide. You're leaving your family to go be a monk. You're not practicing the whole ancestor veneration piece. And so it becomes really frustrating for a lot of people as a result that weren't monks, that lost sons or daughters or whatever to the Buddhist faith. And Buddhism's from outside of China. It originates in India. It's a foreign religion. People fear things that are new, they're uncomfortable with. And so as a result, it's considered foreign. It's weird to traditional Chinese thought. Doesn't also help that there's a big rebellion that springs out in the 700s. So now during the Tang Dynasty, it's what's called the An Lushan Rebellion. And the An Lushan Rebellion is led by a foreign general against the Tang Dynasty. All right, so because a foreign general tries to upend the Tang Dynasty, it's one, going to severely weaken the Tang, as we see here. And then two, it's going to increase what we call xenophobia. So basically the fear of things outside of your race, so to speak. So It's not Chinese. It's foreign. It's alien. It's weird. And that's what this xenophobia increases. Well, also, Buddhism is foreign. It's weird. So if a foreign person is leading a rebellion against the Tang emperor, oh man, Buddhism's foreign too. They might practice that. So I equate it to, if you think back to during the September 11th attacks of 2001, when the Twin Towers fell, and because of Al Qaeda and terrorist groups were blamed on that, and it was a radical Muslim terrorist group. People then said, well, all Muslims are bad. They're foreign. They're weird. When that's not the case in any way, shape, or form. But that is how it was portrayed and how a lot of people started to think of that. Same thing happens here in China. It's not right, but it's what happened, sadly. Also, what happened to this, very interesting note, the Tang actually needed help to put down this rebellion. It is a huge one in Chinese history. The death toll is still disputed, but supposedly it's one of the larger ones in Chinese history. Regardless, what happens is the Tang have to get another nomadic group. Remember, there are tons of different tribes of nomads out in Central Asia. And they need a specific group called the Uyghurs to help them. I love the word Uyghur. And by having to get an outside nomadic group to help them, the Tang showcase their weakness. And it's also just kind of an interesting of how, they have to use nomads to sometimes help put down other rebellions, maybe of nomadic influence too. All right, finally, because of An Lushan Rebellion, because of this growing resentment during the Tang Dynasty, there starts to be a movement against Buddhism from a state level. And Han Yu is a very prominent politician and leader at this time that basically starts to motivate popular support against Buddhism, starts to write a lot of things. And he's saying basically everything we mentioned in the previous slide. It's foreign, it's weird, it's stealing our sons and daughters, it's taking money away from the Chinese society. So starts to rile up support. And then finally, the Tang emperors will actually support the imperial persecution. And they're going to go around, they're taking hundreds of thousands of monks and nuns, and you got to go back home. You have to return back to society, pay taxes again, because they weren't paying those taxes to the Chinese government at the time. Remember, it's kind of crazy how much money and wealth you can accrue when you don't have to pay taxes. Anyway, they'll even destroy monasteries as a way to kind of rid China of this Buddhist influence. However, Buddhism is going to stay in China. It may not be as quite state-supported, and later on in that Song dynasty after the Tang, we see that Neo-Confucian, that blend of all three. And that's really what's the legacy of Buddhism in China. A lot of people still practice many aspects of it. The phrasing of this is what number 5 is. They say that a Chinese person might have a Confucian thinking cap, a Taoist robe, and Buddhist sandals. And essentially they're incorporating all three within themselves. Doesn't mean they're physically wearing these things. It means that these three philosophies / religions provide answers to the general questions of life: how to interact with others, how to interact with nature, what happens in the afterlife after you die. And so by using all three of them, you kind of get the answers that you need to things. Okay, that's chapter 8 notes in a nutshell. We'll look forward to seeing you soon and keep working on this stuff. Thanks. Bye.